So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our panel. We have Michael Connolly, who's the IEP education advocate at McAndrews Law. We have Dr. Neil Broxman, Assistant Director of Special Education, North Penn School District. Kimberly Myers, Director of Special Education, Special Services, Hatboro Horsham School District. Rebecca Fogel, Director of Patan. Natalie Sokol, Assistant Director of Patan. Kate Giacovino, Supervisor of Special Education with the Hickman School District. Diane Perry, Family Resource Specialist, Peel Center. Jeanette Rizzo, Associate Director, Disability Resources and Services, Temple University, Ambler. Sarah Feather at the Upper Dublin School District. So if I could ask you sort of, I'm going to start with you, Kate, to just go down the panel, talk about what you do and sort of how it fits into the IEP process.
My name is Kate Giacovino. I am a special ed supervisor at Wissahickon School District. I just want to say too, our director was going to be at this meeting, but her daughter got married last night. So she asked me to come. But she said she's sorry she cannot be here. So I'm a special ed supervisor. So I oversee special ed programs in our elementary and also our autistic support programs K to 12. In the IEP process, I can be there for multiple roles. So I can be there to ensure that I am the local education agency, which I think is one of the questions we'll talk about what that means. But I also can sometimes go in other roles. Sometimes I'm just the special ed supervisor. I might go there just to meet families, to hear about a child's program, and sometimes to also provide additional feedback or input to a team because I'm also a board certified behavior analyst. So I might talk about behavior or some of the science of literacy or science of instruction. So there's many roles that I could do.
Michael Connolly, I'm an attorney and I represent families in education matters. That can range from attending IEP meetings to representation in administrative hearings, state and federal court matters, but generally working through the IEP process at the families.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Kimberly Myers. I'm the Director of Special Education and Special Services from Hatboro Horsham. What that means is I'm in charge of all of our special education programs, but also including our counselors, our psychologists, our nurses, and all of those providers that you would think that can give something extra or different to students within our general education and special education programs. My initial background, I also am a nationally certified school psychologist. So in my involvement in the process can be anything from that overall programmatic view and being that local education agency representative to being a more active part of that team and or guiding the members of that team regarding resources or support. And much like Kate, I also do like to go to meetings to meet families and to have a better understanding of the student's point of view when it comes to how we're delivering services.
Good morning, or we're still in the morning. Good to know. Neil Broxman, Assistant Director of Special Education and Student Services. Our director extends her apologies. She couldn't make it as well. She was actually attending her cousin's wedding, so from Wissahickon, so that's why she is not here. My role and involvement is, as Kim referenced, in terms of special education and student services, is very similar in terms of the types of programs that I support our director with. Attendance in IEP meetings is a big portion of my job, is representing the district and offering as a local education agency, the LEA, and I apologize, the first acronym, attending those meetings and offering what the resources and the support the district might be able to support a child with. And then also supporting the teachers and the team, the related service providers, supporting them with the professional development, the resources, any structures that we might need to put in place to support our overall school district team and supporting kids. And then the last thing I'll mention is I've also been on the other side of the aisle. So I have two students on the spectrum. So I've been a parent at IEP meetings. And then I have a child with an auditory processing disorder with a 504 agreement, a chapter 504 agreement, which we'll talk about as well. So I get to live the parent side of those things as well.
Hi, I'm Diane Perry. I am a family resource specialist at the Peel Center. And what the PEAL Center is, we actually have a table out there, but PEAL actually is an acronym. So it's Parent Education, Advocacy, and Leadership. And my role there as a family resource specialist is to help families and youth navigate the special education system, understanding your rights, the processes, the forms, anything that has to do with special education. I also wear the hat of a parent of a young man who is 30, who actually gave me my career in the work that I do. So, you know, he gave me all the ins and outs of everything, and now I get to share all that knowledge with families. But we also do a lot of trainings as well. We have archived webinars on our website. We actually do trainings in districts for the local task forces, wherever they need us, we go there and we work along, making sure that not only families, but all the professionals that support the families and the youth, making sure they have all the resources that they need to navigate the special education system.
Thanks. Hello, everyone. My name is Becky Fogel. I'm the director of the Patton East office. And Patton, sometimes known as Patan, it's okay, either pronunciation is correct, is the Pennsylvania Training and Technical Assistance Network. Still doesn't tell you what we do, right? So the bottom line is the Patton system is the training and technical assistance arm of the Bureau of Special Education, also known as BSE. So we take our direction in our work from the Bureau of Special Education. My personal background related to the IEP process, similar to my colleagues to the left, began as a family member. My older brother was around before there was such a thing as IEPs. It wasn't even a legal thing. I remember when that happened. And he, like Diane, that directed me to my career in special education. I later became a parent of a young man with disabilities who had an IEP through late high school when we changed it to a 504 plan to prepare him to go to college so that plan could follow him there. And then I also was a special education administrator teacher. So I wrote IEPs, served on those same types of responsibilities to IEP teams as an administrator. And now working with Patton, we work at developing resources to help support teams that are working through that. And I'll let my colleague Jackie talk a little bit more about that.
So my name is Jackie DiDomenico, and I am not Natalie Sokol, but I'm with the Patton office in Malvern. My title is Family Support Specialist. So I think there's a trend here on the folks to my left that I come from the parent perspective. When I started my job at Patton 19 years ago, I had one child with an IEP. Over the course of time, I had a child get a 504, and my third child got an IEP as well. So come to this work with experience of having to navigate special education, and that's what my job does. I take phone calls, I direct parents to the understanding what the form they've received from their school district is asking them, and help them navigate to connect with the right person in their school district to direct any questions they have back to who might be able to help them. In addition to that, I am the state lead for our statewide family network called Families to the Max. We also have a table outside, and our colleague is with us to help provide you any resources and connect you with either the Patton website or any of the partner agencies that we can direct parents to. With synopsis.
Good morning. My name is Jeanette Rizzo. I'm the Associate Director of Disability Resources and Services at Temple University. I started out my career as a speech language pathologist in the K-12 world, and then recently moved into higher education. At Disability Resources and Services, as a Student Services Coordinator and Associate Director, my role is to help students and families get set up with reasonable accommodations as they move into the post-secondary world. And then once those accommodations are established, we serve as advocates for students and help them in navigating their time in the classroom with their professors and advocating on their behalf. That's it.
It happened.
That's it. That's all.
I'm Sarah Feather. I supervise special education in the Upper Dublin School District. I started as a special education teacher and then moved into administration for the past 8 years. And my role, similar to our other supervisors here, starts with what does that student need, making sure they have access to the educational programming that's offered at our school district, and working closely with parents, teachers, providing them with the materials they need, information, collaborating, and just doing whatever's needed for those students who've been identified with special education needs.
The process begins with the parent who is recognizing there's some type of difficulty. Whether it's way early, so we have early intervention where they're not meeting their milestones. And the Montgomery County IU is one of those areas that you can request information through. What parents need to know is you start that conversation and there should be a response. Yes, we'll do this evaluation. No, we don't see a need for this evaluation. And then you can dispute that. If you still see something, you can go back and say, no, I really want this evaluation. If it's school age, it's the same process. You're going to contact the school, whether it's your kindergartner is not progressing in kindergarten, or you're noticing that what the work that's coming home is making them struggle. That's when you contact the school and say, hey, I think there's something going on. And here's what here's what I'm seeing. So you might document. They're struggling with this homework. They're not making friends. They can't tell me what their day was like. Those are really key indicators for a small child. That way, you've again started the conversation. Requesting evaluation is the next step. So you can first say, I think there's an issue. How do we proceed? When you request evaluation, again, it can be done in writing, always the preferred way, because if you're just doing a conversation to conversation, you have no record. But if you do put it in writing, I'm requesting evaluation. Again, the school district's responsibility is to come back in writing and give you, here's what we're recommending. They should give you a time frame. That evaluation. Anybody else?
So make sure you can hear me. I do think it's also important from a school district lens to share that there's a lot that can happen and should happen between when you are noticing or child teachers noticing some concerns and that evaluation. So all districts have, and it varies in how you connect them, but all districts have teams that will support students and provide interventions through the general education program while you're working on what's going on. Because what you want is, while you're trying to figure out what this is that there's some intervention happening during that time. So when you're looking at some of the questions are, why doesn't the district always want to go straight to an evaluation? Sometimes it's because we want to see if other things can work or not. You can request an evaluation at any time. We will all respond to that. But there are a lot of good interventions through our general education programs in all of our districts. There's a lot of supports that can be put in place for students while a process is going on. Something else to mention, your child's teacher is your first line of defense, the school counselors, if you have them, and then certainly any of your principals, assistant principals, or leaders will help you. It's just reaching out to say, hey, I need some help, and for them to be able to respond to that.
I know we've touched on some of this, but can one of you explain the IEP process? What's the difference between IEP, gifted IEP, and the 504 process? And do they overlap?
So
Go ahead.
go ahead,
All right.
Michael, go ahead.
So, well, the IEP process, we just talked a little bit about how you start that IEP process, but I mean, the difference is for a regular IEP, right? That's designed to address the student's educational needs or deficits that he or she may be experiencing. It includes goals. It includes specially designed instruction to assist the child. 504 is the eligibility for that is different. It's more broad. It just requires that a child have a disability or be considered to have a disability, and that they have that disability is impacting them in a major life activity, one of which is learning or education. The difference between what the services that you're getting in a 504, they are more accommodations. There is no specially designed instruction. as part of a 504. And one of the other big differences between eligibility for special education and 504 is that whole concept of specially designed instruction. So for special education eligibility, you need one of the enumerated disabilities in the IDA, another acronym, the Individual Disabilities Education Act, that creates the whole existence of an IEP, where that requirement for specially designed instruction is not present in becoming eligible for 504. The gifted aspect is a state law, so that is it's different in every state. Some states have gifted education programs, other states don't. And so it's all controlled by Pennsylvania law. The process is, in starting, it is similar. There's an evaluation, there's eligibility requirements, and if eligible, you get a GIEP or a gifted IEP that is focused on the child's need for acceleration or enrichment of their education basics.
So in terms of whether those can overlap, if you have a gifted IEP, that GIEP, you can also have a 504 plan that is related to a disability you may have. If you are a child with a disability who has been found eligible for special education services and you also have been identified as gifted, that all falls under the IEP. So you would not have a gifted IEP and an IEP at the same time. It's one document. You would also not have an IEP and a 504 at the same time. What you would have under the 504, though you still have the same rights as a child with a disability under an IEP, the 504 accommodations and supports would roll into that IEP. So that's very confusing at times. And then the question then we often get is, well, what happens if my child has a GIEP and a 504 and then all of a sudden they qualify for special education? You now shift to one document under the IEP. And we try to walk you through that process in order for that support.
So for an IEP meeting, you're going to have the parent. Parent is a required member, depending on the age, the student themselves. And sometimes that's a parental decision and a collaboration between the school district and the family at what time potentially and age appropriate that they feel as a team that the student may attend. Diane, I'll let her, I don't want to steal her thunder. She might want to talk about like some student-led IEPs where as students grow in their advocacy and the ownership of their disability, we start to introduce the idea of students helping lead those discussions and be a more vocal member of the team. You're required to have a regular education teacher at that team meeting as well. So the student's second grade teacher, their Algebra 1 teacher, there has to be at least at a minimum one regular education teacher. That doesn't mean more can attend, but at a minimum. The special education teacher will be a team member in attendance. And then any other related service providers would attend as well. If the student qualifies for speech services, OT, occupational therapy services, physical therapy, any of those other services, they may qualify. And also it really is driven to some degree in terms of invitation, the other needs the student might have. So if the student has medical needs, the nurse might be invited as a team member. Really is driven about those needs. Also, there is a representative that is in a sense, a decision maker, that term we talked about, LEA, that is the representative that can help commit resources and make final decisions about what a district can do in terms of what's being asked of the parent in that meeting. So that individual would be there as well. And then obviously families, the district themselves, and families can invite members of their choosing in forming the district of who they may want to have there. For example, they may want to bring a Diane as a resource and have them attend, a Michael and have them attend a meeting as well. So they can be present there as well. And then try to think if I'm missing anyone else. And then as students get older, when we start to talk transition, we might invite outside agencies of the district to support a student, like our Office of Vocational Rehabilitation, OVR is our acronym for that. An individual or representative may be inviting of a student depending on their disability. We might also invite a supports coordinator, which supports students that are exiting K to 12 services and secondary services and moving into adult services with more significant disabilities. We might invite that supports coordinator to a meeting as well. So it can be a relatively small team, but can grow quite large as well. And I think that, and then I'll turn it over, is one of our areas of growth, I think, even for us as a district, is helping manage that team to not overwhelm a parent. Because I can envision walking into a conference room when we were meeting in person, some are virtual. There's a slew of panel that could be almost as big as this of educators and experts in their field. And sometimes that can be intimidating. I even know from my own wife, she would never attend an IEP meeting without me. She felt intimidated. So that's the team. And our hope is that you don't feel that in that environment and you feel as meaningful participation, that you are meaningfully contributing and being part of that team.
And I think it's important for you as families and parents to know as well that you are able to bring whoever you would like to the meetings as well. We often have outside related service people come, so we might have outside occupational therapy or speech and language therapy. Our therapists come. We have had behavioral therapists, board certified behavior analysts come, just so there's that consultation piece so that we are doing some overlap with people from outside and we know what each other is working on. It's very helpful, even if they give us written input, to be able to review and consider that as part of the IEP process.
If you do happen to be bringing an advocate or an attorney with you, it is a good idea to let your school district know that you've made that decision and not surprise them with our attendance, because particularly if you're bringing an attorney, oftentimes the school district is going to be more comfortable if they have their own counsel there. And you may end up having your meeting scheduled if you just show up with an attorney. So if you are bringing an attorney, it's a good idea to let us.
I mean, I guess I could start a little bit. No.
Sorry, you can say it.
I can start. Please chime in. So there's always going to be an LEA at your meeting, and I think it was explained a little bit that is a person that can make decisions kind of about allocation of resources and help support the team in decision making at the meeting. A case manager is typically the special education teacher who oversees that student's programming. They are generally the one who is writing the IEP and also ensuring that the services and programs are put in place. They kind of manage they might manage and collaborate with related services. And then supervisor, a lot of times as a supervisor, I will come to an IEP meeting, but again, I could be the LEA at the meeting, but other LEAs that generally come, at least in our district, are principals, assistant principals, sometimes our counselors have been trained to be LEAs, and sometimes even our school psychologists will be an LEA in a meeting. So sometimes if there's already an LEA present, I might sometimes come in and take over that role, or I would let them be the LEA and I myself would just be a participant as a supervisor.
Can I just add to that? I think there's something to be said for depending on the size of the district you're working with too. You could have the LEA, the local education agency representative, be multiple people on that team versus if you're at a larger district, you could have 3 people taking 3 different roles. Yeah. So I think sometimes parents think, well, why are there only 4 people in here when there's supposed to be 7 people on this, panel of people experts? And sometimes it's because in different sized districts, those roles can be played by the same person.
That would be designated on your, at
Correct.
least in the IEP itself, once that.
Who's
that
doing
is
which
handed
role
out.
is.
The case manager, I would note, is your day-to-day, week-to-week contact. That's the person that most intimately knows your student's IEP, probably most intimately knows your student and child. So that's in terms of their role. They're the individual you're probably contacting the most and have the most communication with. Not to say you can't reach out to those other people, But that's you, I envision you will be in more direct communication with people.
And I think it's important to mention that also that case manager may or may not be the special education teacher who's providing direct instruction to your child. That could be another individual on the table. So kind of what you're hearing from us is a lot of it depends. For example, in Hatboro Horsham, the ones being the LEA would not be our counselors and psychologists, it would be our principals, other administrators, and our special education supervisors.
You know how we
I'll take that one. Um, so, it does start with that evaluation process, right? That's the very beginning, when we just started with this process. That evaluation is really important and critical in identifying the strengths and the needs of the child, because a good evaluation equals a good IEP. So that evaluation is really, really important that when that's being done, that all the areas of needs are being addressed, that you're bringing in any of the experts that need to address any area that you feel your child is, struggling in. And that can be, the struggles could be seen by the teachers, it could be seen by the parents as well. And so when that evaluation is completed, then you go into the IEP, and that beginning section of the IEP called present levels is when you're going to take all that information from the evaluation and put it into the IEP. A lot of families will say, why is it the information's repeated? What do they keep on repeating things for? And I tell them that's because it takes from the one document and puts it into your legal IEP. So when you go through that present level section, it's really critical that, yes, we're identifying the needs, but really looking at the strengths of the child is really, really important, because that's where you're going to build on, okay, what can they do and how can we build on that? So I know as a parent, walking through those evaluations were usually painful. They were like, I always said to my husband that here comes our reality checks, because we knew David could do a ton of stuff. But we also know that on paper, when they do these evaluations, it would always kind of like bring it down, or, well, he's at this level or that level. I'm like, okay, fine, he's at that level, but here's what he can do. And how can we build on that? So I really encourage families when talking with them and helping them prep for IEP meetings to really look at those strengths, and let's figure out as a team with the school, how can we really build upon that? And that's when you're going to write the goals and, get any of those other specially designed instruction pieces that are going to assist the family and the whole team actually for the child to be successful. And let's not forget that, that child's voice is important as well. They know what works for them. And yes, I'm going to put that extra plug in for that student-led IEP, because I just came from the transition conference, and these are youth who are like 14 and transitioning out. And they spoke about what they knew, what worked for me in school, what doesn't work for me. And that voice is really important, because unfortunately, some of the stories that we heard were, they didn't listen to me, they didn't think it, but they really do have a lot of power and what works for them and what doesn't work. So I think it's really important that not only the families and the school personnel are looking at those strengths and needs, but the student's voice is part of that as well.
I'd say the evaluation process, we think about it as a testing, but it involves the parent. You as a parent have say, and there's documents that you should be completing, whether it's a rating scale, whether it's questions answered, because you have a lens that none of us in the school district will have, because they're your child. So that's another important piece to know. That's part of that evaluation process.
When you're looking at strengths, what are you looking at?
I think from some anecdotal things, I can tell you that I had a girlfriend that said, if you sing anything, she'll listen. And the staff took that and internalized it. So if the child wasn't listening to transition from one classroom to the other, they knew they could sing a song. Now, mind you, I don't know how many, wants to, raise your hand, let's sing every day at school. But that talent that the mother recognized in her child was phenomenal in progressing her from elementary through high school, because it gave the professionals working with her on a regular daily basis something that was a strength in that child. Like, if you sing it, I'll do it. So it's that kind of, seems like I'm like tiny little factor, but it progressed to be something that promoted her through school. So when we look at those strengths, knowing that your child loves marble and putting that somewhere in a document, so they were like, okay, well, we can use this to our advantage. Children who, may have a strength in math, but not in language arts, have them, do word problems, because now you're bringing the deficit of reading into the strength of math. So I think when we look at things, and I often say, if you went into a room and had your spouse tell everybody what was wrong with you, yeah, that's not a fun day. And that's what we go into as parents from an IEP. We look at it from a deficit perspective. So it's kind of flipping the conversation or flipping the script. Not reading on grade level is not the same as can read at a third grade level. So yes, they're in a fifth grade setting, but they're reading at a third grade. So if you flip it to reading at a third grade level, okay, so now the goal is to improve that reading level, instead of focus on the fact that you're nowhere near the fifth grade reading level. So it's kind of looking at it from that strength-based perspective. Hopefully that helps both, conversations. So the parent is giving them strength-based in the school.
I would say too, it's important to know that when we're looking at the evaluation, we're really child, so it's not just, you're going to get an intelligence test, an achievement test. We're looking at many other factors like executive function, so like how you complete tasks, task initiation, all of those things in that pre-prep. But also some other things, maybe adaptive skills, depending on your child and what some of the needs were seen before the evaluation or in the process of the evaluation. So we really are looking at social emotional awareness. We're pulling from all those pieces. And really, I think we take from strengthening from all of those areas.
I also think, to your example, we need to build the ability and the comfort for a parent to say, why did you put a goal in here that's opening a box? Like, why? Like, a parent is an equal member on that team and should be able to have that conversation. Maybe there's a really good reason, but that should be explained. A parent shouldn't walk away from an IEP meeting and not really understand why the goals are selected, how they're going to be monitored, how I'm going to know if they met the goal, what's the next step, all those questions. It really does have to be a team. It shouldn't just be me as the teacher saying, here's your goals. Like, it does really need to be a collaborative conversation.
And I think when sometimes as a parent, it's hard to start that conversation. So for example, if there's a strength that says they're really funny, that's awesome. I'm sure they are, but that doesn't really tell you anything. So a phrase that you could use that will get people talking is, can you tell me more about that? What makes my child funny? Please tell me more about that goal. What are you trying to get at? And that's a very non-threatening way to get the team thinking, because there could be something really amazing in your child's humor that is such a strength, but it's more than just they're funny. Because just saying your child's funny doesn't really help help drive instruction or help drive support. But understanding that they have a witty sense of humor in certain situations, and this is what it looks like really could. So that's just a tip or strategy. Tell me more about that is something that you can never go wrong with. And that's a really easy way to start a conversation. And they should be able to answer. Very similar. I'll go, and then I'm going to start pointing at people. It's a very similar process. Certainly, unless the child also has an identified disability under IDEA, it would be run by the gifted support teacher, who's also typically the case manager. There is also always that local education representative there. That LEA would need to be there, typically in buildings. That could be the building principal. You may or may not have a supervisor there, depending on what the complexity of the student, and certainly if the child has some medical or other needs for a 504, you may have a school counselor or members of the medical staff there if that's needed. Process is very similar. There's usually a screening process ahead of time, and evaluation drives the development of that gifted IEP. A thing to remember is that that gifted IEP is a strengths-based document. So you're really, which is kind of what we're talking about, the trying with the IEP, but they're not looking at a deficit. So if you're saying, oh, well, my child's struggling in this, the gifted support teacher is going to say, okay, let's take a look at the strengths and how can we support this? But our goals are really related to increasing the strength in that child, and whether they be academic or arts and other things. You're up next.
We have our document, we have our action going. What are the follow-up steps? How often should we expect to communicate about the progress of the IEP? And if you sit down and get to a meeting and say, we don't think perfect wording, or we disagree with something that you want to agree with, but don't feel that it's following up. How do we navigate that process? How often are we meeting to discuss? And then how do we advocate for our child if we feel there needs to be a change?
So in terms of meeting requirements, there's a minimum requirement of once annually. So IEP plans are written for a year at a time. Requires us to meet at a minimum annually. However, any team member can request an IEP meeting. Meaning, as a parent, if you have concerns that, hey, I received a progress report, I'm not seeing the progress I'd hope, I want to have a meeting, you initiate that with your case manager, supervisor, reach out to the building, and within a reasonable amount of time, the team gets together to reconvene in what we would call a revision meeting for that existing annual IEP. And there's really no limit on how often that can happen. Whether it's initiated by the school district, parent, there is no limit on how many times you can get together and meet and talk about a kid and that child and what you want to plan for them. In terms of if there's disagreement about the outcome of a meeting, so oftentimes at the conclusion of an IEP meeting, whether it be your annual meeting, your revision meeting, the district has an obligation to send the parent an IEP along with what we call a notice of recommended educational placement, a prior written notice, which we outline as a district. Here are the services that we plan to propose to deliver your child. Here's the reasons why we made the decision. Here are the options we considered. And then this is our recommended placement. That document affords the opportunity of parent to respond three ways. They can request another informal meeting, and the team gets together informally. The informal meeting, though, doesn't stop in terms of, and Michael might want some tendency in terms of what our recommendation is as a district. The other two options a parent have is what we call mediation, which they would check a box on that NOREP and send it back signed saying they're requesting. One, they would say, I don't approve of what you recommended this with. And then they would say, we would like to request mediation. There's some steps the parent has to follow up within each time you're in a meeting. You should also get what's your procedural safeguards as a parent that outlines your rights as a parent. And that manual talks to you about what do you have to do if you want to request mediation in terms of that discussion. Another box you can check as a family is due process. And that's a formal process which is operated by the Office of LBODR.
Dispute resolution.
Dispute resolution, there we go, thank you. And similar to mediation, there's steps you have to take as a family. Also, if you have disagreement or confusion, what I would always hope families would do to me is call. The relationship piece is important to me. I would hope if families are concerned that the IEP, the revision I saw, our conversation, I don't think we're there yet. I would rather have another revision meeting, IEP meeting, to avoid having to go through the mediation and due process. Those procedures can be lengthy and only delay potentially helping, in my opinion, in some cases, helping a child. Are there ultimately times where a district and a parent or family don't agree and that you would need to use those dispute resolution tools? Yes. that exists. But and others can speak to this, I would hope that a parent and a family at least call, let's talk. We need to have a whole nother meeting. Let's do that again. And then hopefully we can avoid those necessary steps in terms of dispute.
I can help and expand on that too. When the districts give the family the procedural safeguards, it is a document. A lot of times document might be hard to read. There's a lot of stuff in there. And the district should go over those procedural safeguards with you and just kind of guide you through it. In those procedural safeguards, also on the back page is a list of resources. The Peel Center, we are listed on there because we are what's called a parent training and information center. So we're there to help and guide families through that process. Patan is listed on there, and several other resources are listed on their Education Law Center. And again, I say they're resources because what our role is to help families, number one, understand all of those procedural safeguards, and then to give all those options. And what most of the times, I get a lot of calls at the Peel Center because there is a breakdown in that communication between the families and the districts. And so my role is to try and figure that out. Let's all right, what's going on? I'm here to listen, and then let's try and figure out how can we start to figure out what's going to be best for your child. And when I do talk about procedural safeguards, I do always want to say that on the Peel Center's website, we actually have video vignettes. And I tell this to the districts too, that every procedural safeguard is like a video, because it is a lot to read. And sometimes it's, difficult to try and follow. Well, it says this, what does that mean? So we have these videos that are on our website, and it's just really, it's a conversation between two parents just kind of talking about that procedural safeguard. It breaks it down in a more easy to follow kind of thing. And so because I know it's very difficult to manage all that. The other thing I wanted to say is when there is a dispute, what we try to do and what I try to do in my role is to really do exactly what Neil said. Did you call the supervisor? How did you notify them yet? Go up the chain of command. It's important to, start with the teacher or the case manager, and then you work your way up. And it's okay to do that. My child's going to be, they might be afraid that their child gets, reprimanded somehow or whatever. No, that's not going to happen. And plus, as a parent, you do need to advocate for your child. So let's go through that and let's come together again. Let's try and figure out what's going on here. What are the real, issues here at hand, and figure out, can we work it out at another IEP meeting? Do we need to use and mediation? While mediation is a process, they do schedule them pretty quickly. And a lot of times, it is an opportunity. I tell the family it's not an IEP meeting. So it's an opportunity for you to get into a conversation and try to work out what the issues are. So you're not going through everything. It's just what are the issues, and you get to address it. You both get equal time to talk, and then you try and negotiate it. And that independent facilitator of the mediation, is there to help and provide that process of a better communication avenue. So I do encourage that a lot of times. If there really is something happening that is really hard to navigate, then let's try and have that conversation in a different manner. And maybe, you could be more successful in that. And you do get legal agreements out of that as well. So all those options are there for families to utilize as well. So just wanted to add that.
If I could just add that Neil made mention of pendency, and just so everybody understands what that is, that's what is going to be done while you're trying to work out or resolve whatever the disagreement is on the IEP. And that only comes into play in two circumstances. That is, if there is mediation that's been requested or due process that's been requested, then pendency comes in, which means the new IEP that's being proposed cannot go into effect until there has been either resolution of the mediation, or the mediation process has concluded, either because you went through it or one party decided they didn't want to participate, that is voluntary, or due process is resolved. That pendency is really only important if there is either being something added to the IEP that you do not want implemented, or something is being removed from the IEP that you do not want removed, and you don't want that to happen while you're trying to resolve it. then requesting mediation or due process within, and it has to be done within a 10-day time frame for that tendency to kick in. Once 10 days pass, the new program can go into place whether you agree or don't agree with the new program. But otherwise, I do agree with what Neil said. With saying the best course of first action is to try and see if you can resolve it. Mediation and in particular due process is not fun for anybody. It's not fun for the school district. It's not fun for the family. And it's not the best way to get things resolved. Sometimes it's the only way to get things resolved, and you have to go down that road. But I agree, you're also, this is not a situation where it's a business dispute or a slip and fall. This is a relationship that families and school districts together, you've got, at least 12 years, and depending on the nature of the disability, possibly longer, that you're going to be working with these folks, and the district's going to be working with you. So if it is something that can be resolved, in the long run, that's the best case scenario, and that's the way I think, certainly the way I look at it, and I think a lot of attorneys look at it, that if you can resolve it, even if you have attorneys involved, that is the better end result, both families.
There's also another option. There are more options out there, but you can also do a facilitated IEP meeting. Contact ODR to set that up. I have also, I'm sorry, Office of Dispute Resolution. Did get me. I've also, as a supervisor, contacted them to have them. I talked to a family and they said that they were willing to engage in a facilitated meeting. So that just brings someone from the state who is a trained kind of mediator. They're just there as a partial person to kind of talk through the issues. They're really good at getting both sides to give their, whatever their case is, whatever they're trying to implement. That's just, again, another option for you as well. I think that can be really helpful.
Bottom line is the communication is really important.
It is.
Because that's how we provide the student with the services and the support that they need. And that's ultimately our goal, is supporting the student.
It's always nice to go in district, but sometimes parents are fearful. And I'll tell you, having been the parent and having people say, well, they won't do this, or they won't do that, or they won't do that. It's a narrative that's not always accurate. Districts are not, there to put roadblocks in your place. Parents are not there to stress the district. Sometimes that narrative gets pressed. But having an outside agency like HEAL, which is the Parent Education and Advocacy Leadership Center, or PATAN, we get calls from parents and they're like, I got a form, I don't know what it's asking. We navigate with them through the form. Or I have this document, I need somebody to go over it with me. And they have parents advisors that will be able to, now we do it virtually because it's always a great option, especially if you're located somewhere where we can't get to you. Or they can sit with you and look at that document and explain. I always recommend, is there someone in the building you can talk to? Your child's teacher, guidance counselor, secretary in the front office. Who is it you're comfortable with that you see on a regular basis that knows you and knows your child? And usually they'll come up with somebody, oh, Mrs. So-and-so or Mr. So-and-so or this person. I'll say, see if you can sit with them and help that, have them read it with you. They may refer you to somebody in the special ed department because they're going to know more about what it is the document's trying to do. Oftentimes telling parents that it is their right to fully understand a document and that they should not shy away from it because they have, a literacy issue or a language barrier. Language barriers are huge. Most of our forms are in English and they're written for English speaking individuals. And I can't imagine trying to have an IEP for my child done totally in Chinese. I would be like, what? So you take that perspective and you say, yes, you should know what this says. You should know what it's informing you. If you're going to be asked to make a decision based on that information, you should be knowledgeable about what's on.
I just have a question about meaningful progress. So you get an IEP report, meaningful progress.
So meaningful, what is meaningful education has been That's been litigated since the law came into existence. It's not really defined with any level of specificity anywhere. And that's because it's very individualized based on the student, right? It's kind of hard to give a bright line test of what's meaningful progress. So it depends on the ability levels of the child, the nature and severity of the disability. So in theory, for some students, a year's worth of progress in a year's time is reasonable to expect. For some students, it might be more than that. And for others, it might be less than that. So it really depends, individually for the student as far as what's meaningful progress for that.
Not meaningful progress. You're not understanding, well, why? And we explain, why aren't they here when we thought they'd be here? The goal was this, they didn't get it. Why are you saying it's so meaningful? That's the conversation that there's need to have. Because sometimes goals will change because of the child needs, or there's been something that shows that, what we weren't in the right direction first. So those are conversations that should be had along the way. When you go to your annual IEP, it should not be a surprise to any of you where your child is. The only time that there may be new information is really if there's a new evaluation. We're looking at something with data, so now there's this new information to talk about. But based upon the progress reports you get, based upon feedback you should be getting from the child case manager, you should really know where your child is coming from.
And can I just add one thing is that the schools need to provide you progress reports as well. So, you want to be mindful of when you're writing those goals, you're as a team, you're deciding when will I receive those progress reports? How will I receive those progress reports? So the parent should be understanding that as well. And you're going to look at those documents, those progress reports. And, really compare. You can compare then, from the last quarter or last year, this time last year, and really look at that data, because that's what's really going to help the teams decide, is this just progress or is it really meaningful for the child to be working on this goal or not? And the family may decide that this is a goal that, we don't really find that it needs to be worked on right now. Let's move on to some, other areas of need. So again, it's a conversation. I agree.
So as Kimberly had mentioned in her last answer about reevaluation, that leads into my next question, which we had a brief conversation on stage before we began about my experience in this process and the fact that I had misinformation. I was told that as a parent, I could only request an evaluation to be redone every 3 years. And I was actually corrected while we were standing here talking. And it's been years since we had our IEP in process, and I never knew that it was 1 year and not 3 years. So when we had started, we had gone through what is called an SRT process, which we haven't touched base with. Maybe we can talk a little bit about. But my general question is, if the fear was that if I couldn't call for another evaluation for an extended period of time, and the evaluation came back and said that she wouldn't have qualified, what would my recourse have been then? And then once we now have the IEP in place and we're going through the process, how often does a reevaluation occur throughout the process?
I think I've just, before we dive into that, there are legal requirements that the reevaluation process is looked at. So that every 3 years, unless there's it's not intellectual, but or 2 years, depending on the disability category. So it's a 3 year or 2 year that the team's going to say, all right, do we need to do testing or further information so that we can best progress and implement a program, a plan, education plan for the student. If that information isn't needed, then we review those records, we discuss, and it continues on. But you're going to reevaluate, because it is a process. That student is pulled out of their classes. There's time and effort put into that. If it's needed, that's why the law is that we have to look at it periodically so that that doesn't get missed.
But I think it's important to, that's the legal requirement. Nothing says you can't do a reevaluation. And that's what all that does is the sooner it resets that cycle. And so the state and the federal government wants to make sure that we're not going more than either 3 or 2 years for that reevaluation process. You asked a little bit, and Michael will jump in about the idea of what if we disagree with what happened in that initial evaluation or even in that reevaluation. First thing we would suggest is that you talk to the team. Like, what are you concerned about? Because if we miss something, we want to be able to make sure that we're all looking at the same thing, we're answering the questions that we have a good picture of that child and what that means. However, that procedural safeguards document does outline families' right to independent educational evaluation. I do not have that memorized, but the component of that is that you request that after you disagree with an evaluation or an evaluation, you would request that in writing, and school districts are legally required to respond a certain amount of time to that, indicating whether or not you're free to move forward with funding that independent. So there's a difference between can you reach out on your own versus can I reach out on my own and have a school district.
It's one of the most unique areas of the law because it's the only area that puts just on the school district to potentially initiate the process. So under the independent evaluation law, if the parent requests the independent evaluation, that response from the district, they were only given 2 options. 1, agree to fund the independent evaluation, or 2, initiate due process to defend the appropriateness of their evaluation. So it does, and you should keep that, in mind. A lot of times I recommend starting with more of an informal conversation with the district about the concept of an independent evaluation, because once you make that request, one of 2 things are going to happen. You're either going to get your independent evaluation or you're going to need to be prepared to kind of go forward with the legal process of a due process hearing. The district has no other options.
Michael, if you can clarify, so everyone understands. Also, that IEE request, you can only do that based on those either 2-year or 3-year cycles. So you can only make that IEE request for independent evaluation depending on your student's disability every 3 years or every 2 years. You can't. It's not something you can do annually as part of that. Accurate.
It's based on disagreement with the district's last evaluation that they did. Yes.
And I just want to expand on 2 things. One is there's lots of reasons that you might want, you need to reevaluate before the 3-year up, or before whether it's the 2-year or the 3-year annual reevaluation. And it could be, maybe your child has some type of traumatic experience or something totally has changed in your child's life. Maybe you're moving from one area to another. It could still even be within the district, but still just that movement could, so something's happening in school. They're seeing different types of stuff happening in school, maybe not at home. So there's all kinds of reasons. That's why, again, it goes back to the conversation. Why do we need to reevaluate? So I just want to mention that when you do have a reevaluation at other times, there are several different reasons of why that might need to happen. The other thing I just wanted to clarify too is when you do request that independent educational evaluation, if you need to, the district is responding to you in writing, utilizing that same form that's called the NOREP/prior written notice. So it's NOREP, notice of recommended educational placement /prior written notice, and there's check boxes on there, and one of them is them actually responding to your request. So you must get a written document, whether or not they agree or disagree, and that's what the document that's being used for that.
I was going to ask that question as well. So I was trying to decide, because with the process with my daughter when she was in 3rd grade, is we had a CST, which is a child study team. But I know from experience, a parent will call me and it's called different things in different districts. So I'm guessing that SRT might be a student resource team or student.
Quickly that. But you.
I mean, now,
might
I
hear.
think more, at least my experience, more and more, I see districts referring to it as MTSS, the multi-tiered system of supports, is what is what at least.
And typically, if I'm not mistaken, they're called because the school team, the parent is being informed. We're seeing something in your child that says you might have tried interventions that will try across the age group. So your child's in third grade, they've given all the resources that they give all the third graders. They've given an additional support that is universal design for that. And they're noticing that child needs an additional support of some sort. So they're calling you in to have this initial conversation about, we think your child needs more supports. Can we move forward with an evaluation? Yes.
Yes.
No, it's prior.
Right.
But I've seen it both where the school district is initiating. Sometimes in response to a parent request, they might have a conversation about, well, why don't we try this first, which is fine. My only caution is sometimes you can kind of get stuck in a circle where they get some of the supports, they start to do well, they come out, then they start to struggle again, they go back in. So you just got to be careful to monitor that at some point, if they keep going into that process, that evaluation is.
Fact that I understand that have that independent evaluation, that is shared with the IEP team. That's in fact the IEP consider those recommendations. A lot of families at times are under the impression, well, how this IEP is going to do what it says. That's really not necessarily the case. It's another piece of information that's considered in terms of developing and helping with you developing. Question because I've been
We are going to take questions from the audience as we wrap up some of these questions. We just have a few more that we'd like to address that are most generalized, and then we're going to move on to audience questions, if that's okay, of course. So just to touch base on the SRT a little bit. So it was in a very similar situation because we had seen issues in 3 years of preschool and didn't seem to be thriving academically. When I started this process, I went and talked to the kindergarten teacher, and because she had never met my daughter prior to that day, she asked, can I observe, can I see how she is in my classroom for a week or two? And if you would like, I can then call for this evaluation done. The differential, however, is the timeline is not legally binding in the same way that an IEP was. So we did start the process. It was moving amazingly. And unfortunately, we were hit with COVID shutdown 6 weeks into our 8-week evaluation. So we lost that progress. We did end up moving directly to an IEP because it just was too hard virtually to try and keep something that didn't have very stringent, strict guidelines. But for those who are interested in having the school evaluate that don't know, for instance, that their child would qualify for an IEP, if they've talked to the teacher and the teacher can call for this themselves with your permission, they can move forward. So it is an alternative just to kind of get it started and look at the child's progress and where they might be advancing or struggling.
And I think it's important to know too, that child study team, you might also hear it called tiered support, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, is meant to see if less restrictive intervention can help support your child without needing like more intervention within the special ed program. And sometimes students do really react well to that. And you can have some of those supports just in the general ed setting. And I think a lot of research shows, typically, I know in our district, I'm not sure if it's the same, we will have a CST meeting about every 8 weeks because it takes about 8 weeks of data to show whether or not an intervention is working. So it's important to know that too. I know in our district, that's how we, in that CST process, we'll set up a meeting date prior to leaving our meeting to say, hey, we're going to meet in about 8 weeks, make sure that our interventions at this tier are working.
I have a two-part question. So if I'm a parent who's exposed my child with an IEP, and I've got concerns about whether I can refuse the IEP or concerns about stigma related to special education IEP. That's on both those things, like can I refuse and how do you consider types of the process?
Parents can't, and that this is a newer, relatively newer aspect to the law, but yes, parents can refuse initial provision of special education, and it is entirely 100% the parent's decision. The school district can't challenge that decision. And a parent can also, even after being in special education, decide that they no longer want special education. And again, it's parent decision. Everything in between, both parties can disagree and pursue all the due process as far as what a program should look like or what kind of service the child should get. Keep in mind, if you are refusing the initial provision or you decide to then stop special education, any of the protections that go along with special education or any of the supports and services that a child may be entitled to, they stop. And you can always come back later and say, I'd like to start the process all over again and start with the whole evaluation process. But in the interim, those the obligations of the school district to provide those kind of supports and services for IEP, they stop completely 100%. And there's no liability to the school district for that.
What would then typically kick in those situations is that if that child's struggling, they would be brought up again to that child study team, MCSS team, that team to offer intervention and support, because it's never something we want to do nothing to support a child, but the specialized services, especially design instruction that will offer an outline for an initial document or that had been in place would no longer.
I think there's something to be said too for the evolution of special education. The special education that my brother received was, evident. All his friends knew. He was pulled out of class all the time. There were negative connotations, that stigma. The special education that's in place now, especially since with IDEA, the Individuals with Disability Education Act, students can receive services and it's not something that's relatively evident to the other students they're in class with. We pull kids out for violin, we pull kids out for chorus, we pull kids out for whatever. At that same time, a student who is receiving some kind of reading instruction aside might go to the reading instruction. So it's just everybody's leaving the room. When you get into the upper grades, having a student in general education that has certain things that are accommodations or modifications, those are only known to the key people that need to know them. My daughter, who when she got through high school, they said, she's had an IEP since third grade. We don't think she needs it in high school. Now I was an educated parent and they had never met my daughter. So I went, okay, we'll have that discussion in October at her IEP meeting. When I walked into the IEP meeting, they started having the, here's the supports. I said, so do we still think she needs an IEP? And they went, oh yeah, she still needs an IEP. I think a parent needs to know that if the school team hasn't met your child and doesn't know your child and they make a recommendation, take a deep breath and sit back, because we have to get through the process. And I think recognizing that when supports are put in place and when the evolution of the IEP is there, I know a lot of people come to that stigma because, everybody's going to know, they're going to go in a special room. Everybody gets there's connotations, there's bad language used around, kids with special needs. And it's not that case now. So I think sometimes if you're recommending it to the parent, they automatically think you're pulling their kid out where all their friends are, you're putting them in a special room. And sometimes we need to undo that picture, that image that a parent's getting. So if I ever have a parent say, no, I don't want him to be in special ed, I go, okay, what's your image? What is your concern that if your child gets special education services, oh, they're not going to be with their friends anymore. Oh, they're not going to be in their neighborhood school. Oh, that's not the case right now. mean, typically, if a child's being asked at a certain point in time, whether it's the middle of elementary school or middle school or high school, that they're getting identified with a specific learning disorder, needs an IEP, it's not that kind of special ed service where they're going to be removed from what their education experience has been.
We are going to take a short break so everyone can use the restroom. Before we do that, would we like to answer one of the audience's questions, just in case anybody has a pressing question? Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about that. As I mentioned in the introduction, my older brother had significant multiple disabilities, and there was no such thing as an IEP. So he was not allowed to be in public school because his disabilities were so complex. The schools didn't feel an ability to meet his needs. So my parents, we up and moved to different locations to try to get him into a program. We lived in a different state at that time. So I often say my claim to fame is my brother was a student at the Michigan School for the Blind, the same time Stevie Wonder was. That's my claim to fame. So in my mind, they're buds, but not really true. So there were no protections. There was no provision of having to accept any student for anything. And it wasn't until that first original law, Public Law 94-142, came into place that all of a sudden it was a requirement. Now, in my brother's case, he turned 21 that year. Now, in Michigan, the age is 26. I think it still is for services. I've been out of the state for a lot of years. So he had an IEP for like the last 4 years of his career. So you can imagine how successful an IEP was when you're starting it when someone's 21 years of age. Once that went into place, and you're right, there was a requirement now that we have to provide a free and appropriate public education, FAPE, F-A-P-E, to any student with disability. That was a game changer. The laws have changed a little bit, although we're still way behind on reauthorization. We won't go into that issue. But there is that underlying requirement that now students are entitled to that. So when my son was born many years later, I knew right away he had to be eligible for services. Now, his disabilities were evident at birth. So I didn't have to wait until he got to school to see if he, stumbled or had issues. It was very clear, right, literally from the moment he was born. So we were able to get into early intervention services right away, and we had those protections in place immediately. And so now it depends, I think, a lot on the type of disability. Like we're saying, like in my case, my son's disability was evident right away. If you have a student with a learning disability, you might not see that until they've stumbled, and you might sort of think like, oh, it's just normal development. He'll catch up. He can't read yet, but he just needs more time. Maybe, maybe not. But there is a requirement that if there is an identified disability, something has to happen. We have to provide that FAPE. So I don't know if there's additional.
Interestingly, being in Pennsylvania, this is Pennsylvania along with Washington, D.C. They each had around the same time 2 cases going on about the exclusion of students with disabilities from the public education. Here in Pennsylvania, it was the Park Consent Decree, and in Washington, D.C., it was the Mills Consent Decree. And those 2 cases resulted in the IDA that we have today. That's where Congress, it was a result of those 2 cases that Congress developed the IDA. So being in Pennsylvania, you're in a unique state in that the reason we have the federal law that we have across the United States is because of one of the cases that came out of Pennsylvania.
it definitely has evolved. As an anecdotal, I remember my former principal at the high school level, when he came on as assistant principal, 70s, 80s, there were 3 special ed teachers in a high school for 3,000 students. It's the largest department at the high school now. So it has evolved into a robust, partly because of, we're fully transparent, the exclusion, the mistreatment that was done to students with disabilities has resulted in an appropriate response to supporting kids with disabilities.
That will be how we provide services. So, significantly involved. And initially, there weren't a lot of people in the 70s who were like, yeah, let's bring those students. And so that's why we have all the regulations supporting, okay, well, no, the students can't be in the base, and no one ever sees them, they can't interact. Students are a part of our school. How we deliver those services needs to evolve. Technology has been a wonderful tool for a lot of our students with learning differences to be able to remain in the general education classroom more because the computer can be like read for them or better texting certain way so that they have that accommodation in their class. So as we continue to evolve how we deliver this tools, how we listen to our students and families about how impact that helps over time to be. I'm under no illusion that there's not still some students out there. We can hear it, we can see it in our communities. Part of our role is to continue to combat that and to show them who are there, to hear their stories. What is it that really should, because you're agreeing your child needs this, but they're afraid to do that, and what's needed about it. And then work towards leading that child what they need. Because that's ultimately what everybody here wants. We may not always agree about it, but we want to give child in order for them to please them.
No, right, you're talking about a reevaluation as part of the IEP, So it's probably what they would refer to as a standardized assessment that you're talking about, like a Wyatt, or Woodcock, something like that, that you're talking about. So, I mean, if they're at that kind of cusp, they're depending on the area, I think there's probably better assessments that could be used to look at for a child that already has an IEP, to look at whether or not we need to address that in the IEP. Some more curriculum-based assessments, or what they refer to as criterion reference assessments, might give a deeper dive into some of those issues to really explore different areas, particularly, for example, reading, right? You could, on a standardized assessment, you might do a little bit better, but if you do an informal reading inventory or some of the other kinds of assessments that are out there for reading, you might get a little bit of a different picture, and the team may say, hey, you know what, based on this assessment, maybe we should work more on that. Whether it's an actual reading disability or some other aspect of the child's disability that's impacting reading, it could still be something that the team would address, and that might be one way that you might be approaching the district about maybe doing some of assessment to look at it beyond the reevaluation.
There really never should be. So when you those achievement tests, something like range achievement tests, with there's a lot of categories, but there should still be that information about what is the child doing classroom, whether the parents or guardian care teachers, does that mean that? If it doesn't, what does that mean? What are we seeing in that application of reading in the different content areas across the field? So I agree with Michael that if there's a concern in a specific area, I would highly recommend as that reevaluation process is going on at the beginning, you write that down because you're going to have that concern ahead of time. Say, I'm concerned about this, because it then does allow the team to state that teacher guide, and you can have the school psychologist say, well, you know what, I have another assessment that will look very much into this particular portion of the or writing from that, and they can do that. And that's another piece of information. Now, those could come back all in the average. The averaging can be pretty big. What then matters is how does it translate into class? What are we seeing or not seeing? How is students applying what they learned? How are they applying the skills? And really take all that information together to determine what the progress is. For the most part, on achievement side. There's not huge jumps, there can. But typically in stays within a range, and you're looking for them to maintain, get better. You're not looking for them to get better. But you're also looking for those supports and strategies, and interventions that are in place that they couldn't be able to implement those, because that's really what they're in place for. So we can use all those. Part of the difference now is the visibility of students. So children are part of the classroom from the beginning. So what I found is that it's not my students that I need to have those conversations with. Sometimes it's the adults and the community members, because our kids get it. And our kids are the ones, well, why can't playgrounds are a great example. Well, my friend in a wheelchair can't get there because there's wood chips. What can you do differently? And those are student voices coming. So our best teacher is having all of our kids visible and showing what they can do. And that helps to combat all of that. Certainly, their districts have different ways that you teach how to be a friend. What does this look like? But I think and there's some families who would disagree and say, we have some families who want to come in and educate the classroom and are asking, can I come in and talk about autism? Can I come in and talk about this medical disability? And other families want no parts of that. So there's certainly a balance, but what I'm really finding is that our students are the best teachers. And so when they can see that a child's a child and not their disability, sometimes they'll forget that that child's in a wheelchair because they're just Steve or they're just Nancy. They're not that child in a wheelchair anymore.
There is. I don't know if you were going to say that or not. A law was just passed. And that's what we're trying to figure out what the actual name of the law was. But what I will say is disability inclusive curriculum that's part of what came out of the law. I forget the actual name, but maybe one of you guys know. And the Department of Education is developing now. There's going to be how many pilots? Does it say how many pilots?
I can actually answer this. So North Penn is the recipient of part of a grant for pilot curricula to talk about the economic, social, political, to instruct K through 12 students on the political, economic, and social contributions of individuals with disability. So that curricula is in the process of being developed, and North Penn will be one of the grant recipients.
We also, in a broader sense, not just disability related, there are things built in instructionally, curriculum based for the whole range of what I would call social emotional learning that talks about those things of acceptance and those with disabilities, different cultural backgrounds. All those pieces are part of that social emotional curriculum. That does take place in North Penn School District, K through 6. Right now, we're in the process of identifying what does that social emotional curriculum look like at the secondary level, because obviously it has to look different. But there's built-in lessons. North Penn uses Second Step as a curriculum resource that our teachers deliver. And also responsive classrooms is another tool that's being used at the elementary level to build that school community that Kim is talking about, is that you want to build that sense of inclusivity of all kids. And I would say at the heart of it is a sense of belonging. That kids feel valued, a worthy member of their classroom and their school community, regardless of what they're bringing to the table.
I would say Spring Festival, yeah. And that's a really timely question. So the pilot curricula was just announced yesterday, so very timely. I did have a question with what is a specifically designed instruction, and how do I know they're being followed as a parent with a child with an IEP?
Everybody's like,
Who is it? So specially designed instruction, and Michael kind of alluded to this a little bit. It is one of the defining factors from a 504 versus an IEP, is that you're actually developing specifically designed instruction for that student. Sometimes that can incorporate accommodations and potentially also modifications. So accommodations is we're making an adjustment. We might allow you to highlight your text versus having it not be highlighted for you. Modifications, we might specifically be outlining how we're going to modify the content of a science course. It's also going to identify what services you're going to receive in terms of special education services. So it might outline how we plan to intervene if you have a specific learning disability in reading, and what that potential intervention and what frequency to which your student received that intervention. So it really is the specific things assigned to your student that are expected to be delivered to support your child. It may outline instruction in social skills. It might outline instruction, and it might include some behavioral components that Kate can speak to in terms of specially designed instruction. But it really is, what are we doing specifically designed to support your students' goals, and specially designed. The whether they being followed or not, I think is a collaboration. I know teams have come up with fidelity check processes by which they may have another team member, a supervisor, a BCBA, if it's a heavy behavioral component, that actually do fidelity checks to see are those SDIs being implemented.
Describe
CBA, sorry, behavior, you want to
Board
certified behavior analysis. So those individuals, some teams have decided to implement actual fidelity checks to say, hey, outside observer, go check the classroom to see that those things are being implemented.
The other component to this is that as a parent, when you look at that document, for each specially designed instruction that's outlined, it says where it's going to be implemented and what that looks like. So you can ask your child's teacher, and they should have the answer to it. How are you implementing this in your classroom, math teacher? And they should be able to speak to that, because each of the teachers of your child will be getting, or should be getting, a copy of that specially designed instruction so that they know how to best support your child in their classroom setting. This can include specialist teachers at the high school, elective teachers. That specially designed instruction can sometimes be specific to a certain type of class or certain type of instruction, and other times it's more global.
I'd also like to add that depending on what age your child or youth is, some of the teachers and the families go over the IEP and those specially designed instruction pieces with the students. So the student can also know whether or not, I'm getting that accommodation or not, or advocate for it as well.
Whereas my daughter would email her teachers to remind them.
Yeah, good.
Legally, the least restrictive environment is the environment to the maximum extent with other non-disabled, typically developing peers. That's what it is. How much a student is in that least restrictive environment, or what it is for that student, is different for every student, and it can be. So it may not be a full day in regular education. It may not be the least restrictive environment for certain students. For others, it may be. As far as the accommodations, it's whatever supplementary aid support services a child may need in order to be able to be in that least restrictive environment for them. So there's no certain set accommodations or limit on the accommodations. It's really whatever the child needs in order to access their education.
And I think it's important that to note that can change over time. So what that least restrictive environment is in September can look very different throughout that year and even the following year. So it's really coming back to what's the best place for that instruction to occur, and why could that instruction not occur in that general education classroom, which is ultimately considered the most least restrictive environment that there is.
And I'd just like to add too that again, it's going to go back to what we've been kind of saying here all along. It's a conversation. So when you're at that IEP meeting, you are having that conversation about LRE and inclusion. And on the IEP, on the back of towards the end, when you do talk about placement, there's 4 questions that are guided conversations throughout the IEP or towards the end there, that as a team, you're going through each of those 4 questions. What accommodations, what supplementary aids and services have we looked at? What have we used? What haven't we used? Do we need to bring in, any type of outside resources or help, And again, the ladies on my right here from Patan, they're not selling themselves enough good enough, even though they're free. The information they have is free, but the information that you get from Patan for families and schools is phenomenal. And, it has on there all those resources that can help. For example, the framework for access and belonging is a process that you go through as a team, school team, to really see, did we utilize all of these supports and services? How can we, change something? Do we need to bring somebody else in? Again, it's a conversation. And again, from the very beginning, it is in the law, least restrictive environment to the maximum extent possible with their typical peers. That's where it needs to start. That's where the conversation needs to start first. And then you say, can we pull out, so it is a process and definitely a conversation.
Thanks for that plug, Diane. I would say, patent guidance, we're always reminding IEP teams, you start with the general education classroom in their home school, the immediate thing. And then the IEP team is supposed to be having those conversations. What do we need to do to provide that here? We sometimes hear from families, for example, of students who are deaf. They sometimes fight very vehemently, saying the least restrictive environment for my student is a segregated school for deaf because of deaf culture, because of language, ASL skills, and the like. So it is exactly that. It has to be a conversation. It has to be a collaborative talk about what's right for that student. What's least restrictive for Diane might not be what's least restrictive for Jackie, but we always have to start with that home-based classroom situation.
Follow up to your point, what if my school district doesn't offer, have the type or level of service my child needs? What's the recourse and how does that look?
Well, technically, they can't say that they don't have that. They have to figure out how they can provide it, right? So that, again, comes back to a conversation. Like if the school is feeling like, oh, we can't provide that here, you have to have that conversation. Why? What do we need for it to be able to happen here? Or do I agree? Yeah, it really does make more sense for my child to have it here or this support or this place. It comes back to a conversation, but it shouldn't just be cut and dry. Oh, we can't do that here.
It comes down to some of the words we use, a continuum of services.
Mm-hmm.
So it goes from the least amount of service all the way up to when a child may need supports that are outside of the district. And districts do consider at times, HAPA Hersham does as well, are there approved private schools? Are there other programs that are more appropriate? Because what that child needs is so specialized that it's really not possible for us to bring that to us. But that's a conversation with the family. That's not typically where you start. You want to make sure and to kind of exhaust what you can do reasonably in the district so that child continues to make progress. And that really comes down to what we're looking at. Is that child making progress in what we're doing and are they benefiting from that?
In my son's case, we had a reevaluation process. He was in 10th, 11th grade, something like that. And he no longer required specially designed instruction, but he definitely required accommodations. There was no question about that. So together, collaboratively, the school district and my husband, myself, and my son, who was very involved in that conversation as well, made the determination that a 504 plan made more sense for him at that point in his career, and it would follow him into his college career. That wouldn't be necessarily accurate or true for anyone, but in our case, it was a mutually agreed upon decision. It made sense. He still received all the accommodations he needed. But I wouldn't have been able to have that conversation in like 3rd grade. Like if they had brought that up then, I think it would have been a much different, feeling for me as a parent. So again, it's all about the I, it's the individualized, it's what makes sense for that student and that student's needs and what their disability is.
To remove the IEP completely, though, there always has to be a evaluation
Mhm.
first, which is different than removing necessarily changing or removing services within the IEP, but keeping the IEP. There wouldn't necessarily have to be an evaluation, although, depending on what service it is, it may make sense to evaluate that before making that determination. But to take away an IEP, unless it's a family, the parent deciding they no longer want services, a reevaluation would have to occur to support that.
I would say we do that to ensure too that there aren't still needs that require support. Like actually, it's a database. Everyone on it.
Sort of at what point should a family consider seeking third-party help? And will that be held against the child?
I think that's a concern for families, that if they've come to a, roadblock in the conversation, that they're afraid, will this have repercussions on my child? And oftentimes that's when they're calling outside agencies already. They're saying, what can I do? What are my next steps? I think what we try and make sure that when I support, I'm sure it might be similar for other agencies, is kind of like do an itemized checklist. Have you talked to this? Have you discussed this? Have you ruled out this? Have you considered mediation? Not mediation, facilitated IEP. What's that? They might not even know it exists. Have you talked to, and they may have talked to just the teacher. Have you talked to the special ed advisor? Have you talked to, kind of like, have you gone through all those steps? Because as duly noted, we've said you can have mediation, you can have due process, but it's not a fun experience for either side of the conversation, in the school or the parent. Oftentimes when you recommend that, if they check a box on the notice of recommended educational placement prior written notice, known as the NOREP PWN, that's why we use the acronym. Ask for that informal meeting. It starts the conversation. If you get to the point where you can't get past that, that's when you're going to bring in agency support. You're going to reach out to an advocate. You're going to reach out to maybe somebody in the legal department for help. But trying to do it because, if we haven't said this enough, this is like a long-term relationship. You're coming in if you have a early intervention and you're staying on occasion till 21. You really want to build the bridges, not, have, just dismantle bridges throughout the process.
Well, and I would add, I've been practicing in this area for 25 years, and I rarely ever really seen it be held against the family for forcing their child's rights or raising issues, or it's not something that is commonplace. People are human. Do people, might a teacher be upset that you're challenging them or sure, that kind of, but people are human. Have I ever seen people outwardly take steps and that's a rarity, at least in my experience. And that's, I've been doing this for 25 years, 10 of which was on the school district side. So, not something that happens frequently.
I think the tough part of the root of that question is, when does a family consider it? And I think it's tough because it's really up to them in terms of their level of comfort. Obviously, as a school district, we want them to feel free to partner with us and feel that they're an equal team member. But there are times when they may feel they need to bring a Diane, someone else from their family. And from a district lens, I never take that as an offense or am troubled by that. It's a resource they feel they may need to be a participant in the meeting, and that's never held against them from a district leadership perspective. As Mike mentioned, I think no one ever overtly, if there's attorneys in your meeting where your teacher's going to be a little more nervous and a little more reserved, that's just human nature. But I don't think anyone's overtly trying to hold it against them.
And even as an attorney, I've been more often than not, when I'm initially brought in, the intent is not to litigate. It's not to be adversarial. It's to try and come to some sort of resolution. And sometimes families just don't feel that they have the ability to communicate the way that they need to communicate to get that across or to get to where they need to be. And they're bringing, whether it's a non-attorney advocate or an attorney. That's my experience. It's a brave new world when you leave the high school, particularly if you've had an IEP for many years. I know we have somebody from Temple to address it, but it's a very different, and the responsibilities switch, and it's a much different experience.
And before our expert talks about that, just something, if you have high school students, understanding that once you take that diploma, that ends your support from the school district K to 12 program, before that 21 years. So that's that conversation that once your child's in the high school years, that should be something that transition post part of the IEP process. It's actually documented in that individualized education plan. And you need to have those conversations each year so that you're not surprised and you have plenty of time to plan and prepare, whether that's bringing outside agencies to those meetings, whether that's guidance counselors supporting what's next, and helping bridge that gap. There's also districts, and Upper Dublin is one, who participate in some skipping the word right now, but the student is able to participate in some post-secondary instruction and opportunities as they're still being supported by the school district before that diploma is issued. But the diploma is the big time where you're stepping now into the real world, but you're not on your own. There are all our post-secondary education institutions have offices for students, support services for students, and that's something that you definitely would want to be connecting into. And even in some of our corporations, we're lucky to be right here in King of Prussia. There's two that I can think of off the top of my head. I don't have their names correct, so I'm not going to botch that up. But there are companies who are looking for students who may access information differently than they do, or their traditional worker, and they're very willing to accommodate, adjust, support, so that all of these students that we're educating in our districts are able to be productive and contributing citizens. Because that's the ultimate goal, is for them to be independent, for them to participate in their community.
Just to add a little bit to that, there is a big difference in K through 12 and post-secondary education. And the biggest difference is there what you're protected under, what your student's protected under. In K through 12, your student is protected under the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, IDEA. When you move to post-secondary, we're talking about the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, in Section 504 now. The biggest difference in those two laws, and what's important for parents to know, is that IDEA guarantees 6 steps, and that is made through meaningful progress towards IEP goals. When you get to college and you're talking about the Americans with Disabilities Act, you're guaranteed access. Your student has to be otherwise qualified and has to be able to, on their own merit, show that they can meet the technical and academic standards of the program that they're enrolling in. And the university is responsible for providing reasonable accommodations as long as they don't fundamentally alter or make a significant change to the technical or learning standards of a course or program. Something else that is really important for parents and students to know is that now you've left K through 12, you're getting ready to go to college. Nobody, unfortunately, is reaching out to you. It's your responsibility and decision whether your student wants to disclose their disability and seek accommodations. So my recommendation to you all is that when that's something that your transition team, when you're getting towards the end of high school, will work with you on figuring out who to reach out to and stuff like that. But as soon as you're looking at colleges or technical schools or anything, community colleges, trade schools, anything like that, you want to go on their website and you want to find their Office of Accessibility, Office of Disability Resources. What it might be called something a little bit different at every university. We all do very similar things. You want to find out what aids and services they provide and what's the process for that. What does that look like? The sooner you can get that process started, usually you have to have been accepted and commit to the school to get the process really rolling, but you can have a informational meeting before that just to kind of find out hey, what can you do for my student? How would you support my student? So I think that those are the big differences to recognize and kind of be prepared for. I also just wanted to touch on what is an auxiliary aid and service that you might be receiving in higher ed: interpreters, note-taking support, audio and digital books, scribes, readers, and lots of other assistive technology. The kind of accommodations and something else that is important is we're providing reasonable accommodations. We can't provide modifications, modifications being the what, accommodations being the how. So your student might be getting extra time on tests, extra time on assignments, attendance modification. The way the professor delivers the feedback to your student might be electronically versus in person. The same thing with instructions that are being delivered in the classroom. They might be being emailed to your student. And that's just a really small snippet of some of the things that are offered in higher ed. And I think if you're not sure, just ask about it. That's the most important thing. But again, your student's going to be doing all the outreach. The onus is on them to share that information with their professors. And most importantly, the role of the disability offices is so your child does not have to disclose their specific disability to anybody else at the university except for the disability office. Once they have established themselves with our office, we give them a letter. It says this person is protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act, and here's what they're entitled to. And if their professor says to them, well, why? Why do you have this? No, thank you. I don't want to share that information. I'm not comfortable with that. And that's when they come back to us and say, hey, can you have a conversation with my professor? They're asking stuff that just doesn't make me feel comfortable. And that's where we advocate on your students' behalf.
And if I could add a little bit more to that transition piece that and the 21 and beyond, transition is huge. When families call me, you know, like it's my favorite topic, number one, but it's huge. And you know, you're talking when we talk about the IEP, you're talking about transition from at least age 14 all the way up till you exit the school district. So you know, I have to put the plug in that there's a transition conference every single year. I just came from it. It was just this past week. And it's something that Catan and the Bureau of Special Ed sponsors every year. I encourage every family member who's going through transition to go there because that's where all the information and resources are. And in addition to that, families get to meet with families, self-advocates, and all kinds of young people are there. And it's just so energizing to be among the young people and hear them and talk and listen to hear what their hopes and dreams are for the future and so forth. For students who have more significant disabilities or intellectual disabilities, autism, lots of colleges and universities have lots of programs now for them as well. So there's not that you don't have to go through the traditional way. There are other ways now that's other students with significant disabilities can access college campuses and maybe they're going to audit a class, maybe they are taking it for credit. But all the colleges and universities that offer these programs all look very different. Temple does have one on their main campus, and I'm sure you probably know about it, I would think. I don't know.
Yeah. The Institute on Disabilities at Temple University has a wonderful program where students with more significant disabilities are given an opportunity to enroll and audit classes and participate with a peer mentor and still have that college experience. They come out with a certificate. Not a college diploma, but it gives them that same opportunity to kind of see if this is something that they can do. And what I love to see is that we have a lot of students who then transition over to us from that program. They find that, yeah, they can take 1 or 2 classes at a time and can do it on their own with now just accommodations. So it's kind of just like getting their feet wet a little bit with the Institute on Disabilities. Drexel University also has a wonderful program. It is fee-based, but it is for neurodivergent students, not just students with autism. But it kind of provides that extra layer of support that disability offices can't always provide and isn't quite what a neurotypical student would need. So it's like a little bit more than tutoring and a little bit more than accommodation, but you know, they're still there on their own merit and can, you know, just need a little bit of extra support and guidance. So I encourage you to seek, you know, information about this. There's lists on the internet about
thinkcollege.net, if you are interested in those types of programs, is the best place for that because it tells you all of the colleges in every state actually. So yeah, it's a really good website. Lots of good information on there, even about accommodations and goals and all that for the IEP while the student's still there too. So
think the most important point is that you can't wait until a student is graduating to have that transition conversation, right? And it's a legal requirement in Pennsylvania, at least at age 14, but you can even start it earlier than that, depending on the needs of the student. But you can't expect a student to graduate, go to a college class, and be comfortable saying, I'm self-disclosing, I need this account, if they've never done it, if they've only ever had somebody else do it for them. So that's a huge takeaway. It's very different. It's sometimes a shock for families and for students to move from that entitlement of special education services to an eligibility model at post-secondary. So it is something you don't want to wait to the last minute to be ready for.
And I know many districts in Montgomery County have this as well. But in North Penn, we have a individual transition coordinator who primary responsibility is working with families, working with teams to support all kids transitions from those that may be using adult services because the significancy of their disability, but also reach out to your districts about if they have someone within the district that supports those efforts.
Yeah, we have one at Wissahickon as well, but I was also going to say there's also in the county a transition fair, which I believe they brought back last year for the first time after COVID, which is really phenomenal. I was a life skills teacher at high school and went every year, and it was really helpful for my families. All the agencies came together, state services, everyone is there to help you access outside support.
And I think this really illustrates why it's important that we start at age 14 talking about these things. Time flies faster than you think. Even if your child is staying till age 21 within our services, not all children do, young adults do. The other part that I just want to mention during those transition conversations, sometimes there's some really tough questions that the IEP team asks, especially if a child has complex disabilities where they may not be able to live independently. And those can be very uncomfortable for parents because if your goal is that young adult's going to live with me, part of what I do and our transition coordinator does in meetings is challenge that and say, that's wonderful. What's your plan B? What's your plan C? What's your plan D? Because I can tell you from personal experience in my family, it is critical to have those understandings because if something happens to that plan A, which plan A typically they're going to live with me, you need to have services in place to activate those plan B, plan C, plan D, because if you do not and are not hooked up to those services, your family loses the ability to make choices and those are made for you. And that's an extreme situation. And that's something we talk about because it's really, really important. We have some families who are signed up for outside services with the county that never use them. That's okay. Make sure you're signed up. Make sure you're on the list. It's difficult at times. It can be challenging. It can be confusing. That's why we have transition coordinators. That's why we have advocates. That's why we have PAN to help navigate that. Even if you never ever use it, be on the list.
More questions that sort of didn't go into the categories we were using to sort of ask questions. One of which was, why aren't cyber schools used as the least restrictive environment for children with disabilities?
They could be. That's the decision family has to make.
I think it really depends on the student. I think we saw some of this with COVID, right? That was difficult for a lot of students with disabilities to access that virtual environment and learn in that way. And I think that's the concern that comes up when we start talking about cyber program in the context of a student with a disability. Doesn't mean that it can't be inappropriate, and for some it can be. I also have concerns when clients come to me about wanting that, particularly if it's in relation to an attendance issue or like a school phobia kind of issue. Because once you're out of that environment, the more they're out, the harder it is to get back in that environment. So while cyber often can sound like a really good solution in the beginning, in the long run, it's not. So I think there's just a lot of concerns, which that come up for IEP teams when we're talking about it in that context. I mean, technically, if it's a regular education cyber program, it's as in theory as least restrictive as being in the school building. I think it's more a component of the virtual nature and how that impacts kids.
Those cyber institutions and their public schools have the same obligations that the North Penn School District, Pepper Horsham has in terms of evaluation, all the IEP protects, they still have those same obligations.
Yeah, if you're talking about like a charter,
Yep,
a cyber
cyber
charter, school, yeah,
charter.
that's the,
Have
yeah,
the same obligation.
I took that as like a in-house school district cyber program because you would, in a charter school, you would have the same, they would have the same obligation of school.
And then do children in foster care who have an IEP have the same rights to an IEP as children who are not in foster care? And do they have the right to have their IEP transferred as they move like to various custodial changes?
So yes, I'm also our district's foster care liaison. So absolutely. You do? Okay. So absolutely. And it's really even more critical there for districts. And sometimes we don't always know where the children go. But that we have the records and we try and make certain that those follow with the students. Part of what can get confusing with children in foster care is who's the educational decision maker. The acronym for that is EDM. Who's allowed to make those decisions? What does custody look like? What do the biological parents have rights versus somebody else? It's a big complex puzzle, but ultimately stabilizing education and making sure the children have what they need comes first. So we will err on the side of, I can tell you, if a child in foster care comes to our district, and that includes children who may live in group homes, and they have an IEP that's 2 years old, I'll say, okay, looks like you received services. What can we do? Let's take a look and see how we can offer services and get things in place so that we're not waiting. It is certainly a challenge at times finding those records. But we ultimately work as hard as we can. And if it doesn't exist, at least in Hatboro Horsham, and I know my neighbors as well, then we create that base. We'll do that evaluation. We'll create that IP. We'll have everything there. So, and we make sure the child knows you're in Hatboro Horsham. So if you move somewhere else, tell them, and we will provide the records if they weren't provided for you.
Another part of that process is what's called a best interest determination meeting, a bid meeting. And that part of that process is helping make that decision with your district of origin. So where the student was living before they entered potentially the foster care system and now moved to a different placement outside of that district of origin. Those two districts, along with the Office of Children and Youth and the casework, they get together in a meeting and go through a process to determine what's in the best interest of the student. Is it to remain in their district of origin? It may be within enough proximity to say, you know what, the continuity of a student with a disability, their IEP program would be best if we kept them in, even if that means District A, you have to transport them a little further to get to that school. That's part of that conversation. If it's oftentimes the biggest barriers is travel time. So obviously, and being part of the community. So all those things are kind of wrapped up in that conversation, and the student's disability and IEP potentially 504 gifted, even that far. Are all taken in consideration as part of that bid discussion.
Thank you. And then a question about teaching phonics to non-vocal children. Is there a difference in the way phonics are taught to non-vocal versus, I guess, vocal children, and why?
Wish we had our dyslexia team here to really go into the great, and maybe some of the other panelists have that description. We have that conversation a lot about IEP teams making a decision about instructional plans for students with various types of disabilities. Sometimes what gets in the way is a particular program has a very prescribed response time, reaction time. You know, you have to do this. So sometimes it's a conversation about how do we maintain the fidelity of that instructional program for a student who has a processing disorder or has a expressive language disorder. So again, a lot of that comes back to very individualized discussions. I can't really talk to the science of that, but maybe some others can. I know our dyslexia team can, and I don't want to mess up what they would say.
think it's really important. We're still looking at neuro. But I think it's going along with what you're saying. It's how we present. We might be, I know in our district, sometimes what we do is we full research-based programming, but we put things together in a way that might not look like we're doing with some of our other students, because we know that there's certain pieces that might work. Still is based on the science of literacy and that to them. And also knowing too that there are times as well when sometimes we need to work on some critical foundational skills that might be not for every student, but in language and other developmental foundational skills.
We also had that conversation a lot with students who use augmentative communication devices, but that doesn't mean they necessarily can't benefit from some phonemic awareness training, some phonics instruction, things like that. So I think what our guidance would be is never just automatically say, you don't talk, so you don't get to learn how to read, you know.
Thank you so much. I think we've gotten through the majority of the questions that were sent in. I saw a hand here and I have a hand there as well. You wanna?
That's why you can't wait until then. That, to your point earlier, you know, look into options. Use that transition planning portion of the IEP, because it does sometimes talk about kids who graduate to the couch, you know, that they don't have any other programs. You can't wait until they turn 21 and then sign up for stuff, right? Diane, you might have a lot of experience with that. I'm quite sure.
Before
Yeah.
Diane jumps in, I
Go ahead,
also
Jen.
think that it is agency driven sometimes and connecting with other families. As Diane said, we haven't really promoted it. We have tons of publications that Patton puts out. Most of them.
Please
that I-
take some with you before you leave.
There's family friendly ones that kind of soup to nuts. We have the acronym card, which is like the Bible if you don't know all the acronyms. We have a number of publications that help parents along the way in different situations that help them understand the process. There's publications that are developed for professionals, but we think parents can gain just as much information from them. We also have the statewide family network. And part of that network is bringing families together so that if I'm the mother of a 10-year-old and you're the mother of a 15-year-old, you're going to tell me, oh, what I didn't know and I wish I had known. And one of the things that we know is, like you said, there's the black hole, the cliff, the what, and as prepared as I thought I was, I have now a 26-year-old. I was more prepared than I would have been without having the resources that were kind of given to me through other parents and professionals. So the transition team was good. OVR, which is the Office for Vocational Rehabilitation, is now brought in earlier than it was. That was a really good resource. Finding those options for those, what they call the extra, my son liked to say he was a senior when he was getting done with
Super
school.
senior.
Finding how you can use those 3 additional years. It doesn't have to be in a traditional educational setting. It can be in a work study type or a work experience type setting. And your transition coordinator who's been mentioned can really give you those connections outside of school. Community connections, people you meet, people who have known your children a very long time. My son currently walks up at 4 mornings a week to the neighborhood park and shadows a park attendant. It is not a paid position, which is fine. It gets him up out of the house every morning with direction and responsibility. Those are the kind of things that other parents will tell you. And then you share that with your transition team. And I'm willing to talk to the lady at the end of the table about these KOP companies, because I don't know about those KOP companies. Those are the kind of connections you make that help you help your child. And I think the other piece of this that we don't have anybody on the panel as a student. Because I'll tell you, my son would be giving you a whole different story because he has his perspective. So when we talk about what these young adults want to do, whether they're leaving at 18, 19, 20, or 21, their conversation could look really different. And making sure they're involved in that really can change the whole shift. They'll tell you they're going to live independently, and then you have to have those difficult conversations. What does that look like? And if I'm the first one to say, I didn't think college was an option. And having a son who's 26, I have a number of friends that have children in these skills programs, which are community kind of based, like
Community independent.
community and independent, yeah, still community independent living. So they're going and getting a college experience. They're living on campus. They're getting some kind of programming that gives them a certification, not necessarily a degree, but they're also learning how to live independently. They're not at home with their parents. They have their same age peers. They're experiencing the whole idea of getting up and getting someplace on time and following a schedule. All of those things nowadays are not far-fetched for some of these students to consider. But those are the kind of things I think you learn through the process of the village. Your educators, your neighbors, parents, other parents that are raising children.
Transition conference.
That's right. That's right. All those resources you want to tap in. On the Peel table, I also have something that's called the transition checklist. And it's a checklist it's statewide. I know the districts give it out, we give it, but if you haven't seen it, I think it's something really helpful because it starts at age 14 and it goes under employment, post-secondary and independent living. You know, are you doing this? Have they done that? You know, it's a complete checklist. And I remember that was my Bible when my son was in school. Like I wanted to make sure that we were trying to make sure we were getting those services, make sure we're doing all those things at those different age, and it goes by age, you know. What a typical student may be experiencing and having. We also at the Peel Center are having some trainings around healthy relationships. That's something that a lot of parents ask about, students ask about, you know, talking about sexuality and all of that. And sometimes that's very difficult for school districts to address. And it is definitely something that, you know, for many students in school who may not experience a disability, they pick up on certain cues and stuff where a lot of the families and children that I work with don't pick up on a lot of those various cues and don't learn those kinds of things. So sometimes we have to have actually it's called honest conversations. So if you want to stop at my table, feel free to pick that up. And we're doing that not only for the parents, but also for the youth to be a part of that as well. So there's a whole host of things when you talk about transition and falling off that cliff. The only other thing I want to say about falling off the cliff is that even though I had all the connections and resources and everything, in my opinion, I still feel like I fell off the cliff because you're not getting up and going to school every day. I mean, it's a total change. So just that in itself is falling off a cliff, even though you still might be connected for me.
So GIPs it's state law, it's completely stepped. So any of the cases that you kind of read about the IDEA and the federal law and the definition of state really don't apply to gifted. It's all Pennsylvania law, Chapter 16 of the Pennsylvania Code. And there's not a lot out there in guidance. And you know, the reason is there's not a lot of litigation out there on gifted. And in my opinion, the only litigation I ever did on gifted issues was when I represented school districts. I never did it on the parent side because I've never had a parent retain me to do it. And because there's one gigantic difference between us, and everybody's up here laughing because they know exactly where I'm going. Federal law, if you're successful, requires it's a fee shifting statute, and the school district has to pay your attorney's fees. That doesn't exist in Chapter 16. So it is very, very expensive for families to hire counsel, and they don't. And understandably so. Going through litigation can be a very expensive process. So as a result, there's not a lot of court decisions out there defining it. You might find some hearing officer decisions on the Office for Dispute Resolution, ODR's website. I don't know.
Not directly, but I was going to jump in and say there is a Bureau of Special Education advisor for gifted. Her name is Dr. Shirley Moyer. Her email is probably smoyer@pa.gov. But if you go to the Bureau of Special Education Paige. I know you can find her in the drop down. She would be someone that could certainly give resources. And she does some of the monitoring. It's not the same as the special ed monitoring, but I know she does.
I don't know if it still exists. There used to be a statewide gifted organization that was kind of parents and teachers.
Yeah, well,
It's still.
Page, that's
thank
it.
you.
Is it still in? Okay. That would potentially have some, some.
They're really good.
In my experience, it's standard for appropriate is similar, but not quite the same. And because you're really talking about enrichment and acceleration. So it's different, and you're right, it's very confusing, and there's not a good solid definition out there on what is appropriate, either in the statute or in case law on giftedness.
Yes, there is that indicator 13 training that happens while students are still in school. And then there's something called indicator 14 post-school. So that's where they follow up with students after they have graduated, left our, we call them leavers, after they've left our programs, and what they're doing and what's happening with them. So.
Now, I don't know if they report, that'd be a question to go to the state with. I don't know if they report it differentiated by school district. That's something.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. I think it's
yes, I think it's the aggregated for the
you're
state.
correct.
I don't think they don't individually. So like North Penn right now, we were indicators. So we're in the first year is you document who's leaving you. So that was last year. So our 2022 grads, we're now currently following up with. So we have responsibility to go back and survey them and answer questions, and then that's entered into a larger database. But I don't think it's reported out per school.
I think you're correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yes.
Correct.
Okay, so an IEP team and school members should never, ever be telling you to medicate your child. There may be conversations about it. There may be information offered, but that's not the role of an IEP team. We are required to provide supports whether or not, and this is through Section 504 as well, whether or not that child is taking medication. And even if the child is taking medication under Section 504, we're really charged with looking at what would the child look like if they were not taking that medication that could mitigate or change that behavior. So you mentioned the idea, would an IEP team ever talk about a psychiatrist? Potentially. There have been times where the team has said, you know what, we may be requesting a psychiatric evaluation. However, that's the parent's choice. So the parent decides that, whoever the guardian is, and I'm sorry I keep using parent because we have a lot of different families. So whoever the guardian is of that, the parent or guardian of that child. So though medication can be a part of things, and we do like to know that and our nurses absolutely like to know that because it could impact healthcare. Medication is not a deciding factor as to whether or not a child deserves an IEP, deserves a 504, deserves a GIEP. It's just a component of it. You hear the passion in my voice. That's something that really makes me angry when parents say that, or somebody, or if somebody from a district level alludes to that. But in reality, there are conversations about medication. We do ask that because we want to know for a lot of different reasons. I also am in charge of our nurses in our school district. So they would probably like me to say again, if your child's on medication, please let the nurse know. It does impact how we give care. It does impact sometimes if we're seeing side effects or something's going on with the student in the classroom.
It's also helpful to know if there's medication changes that, because even as special ed teachers, while they're taking data, they might draw a phase change line and just say medication change. And we could share that data with you. We've done that for many families. And they could take that data and information to the doctor to show, has there been a significant behavior or even their progress in academics. So it's really good to coordinate with them. Obviously, that's your choice. Might have a team ask if we know you're on medication.
I would say it's an accommodation, right? So you should have that conversation with your team for the needs of that individual student.
Right. So first off, if those particular situations happen, we would love a call or an email saying this is what's going on. But when you're talking about a child's overall plan, the child still has that disability. We'll go with ADHD because you mentioned that, regardless of whether or not they're taking medication. So where the team should be determining, does that child qualify for any other services? Do they qualify for a 504? And you have to take into account, what does that child look like if they're not on their medication? And so that plan should be in place so that if they need that accommodation that day, they can have that. If they don't, great. But we know that that possibility is there. And then you review that plan, or you should be reviewing that 504 plan every year to determine, what does this look like. Same thing with an IEP. Sometimes there's specially designed instruction in place, and it's very specific. You could have a piece of specially designed instruction written very specifically to, should Kimberly not have her medication that day, do this. We would rather do that than be in a situation where we're not providing what a child needs, and that one behavior or that one thing starts to then define their time in school. I hope that made sense.
I think with that, our time is up, and I really want to thank the panel for your candor, for your knowledge, for sharing it on a Saturday for a long period of time. So thank you so much.
Chocolate and the
Yeah.
Thank you for coming.
Sorry, thank you to our staff who worked tremendously hard to put this together.